Hello. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is look at economic growth and the business cycle. And one of the things I'll do is run through a number of terms that you will hear in the news and also we might talk about in other sessions, so you have a bit of an idea of what these actually mean. So first of all, when we look at economic growth, it's based on the rate of change in the level of an economy's output. So, normally we often talk about a whole country like the UK, and we look at this from period to period. So typically we might look at this over 12 months or 3 months. So in the UK, they often report a measure of economic growth every 3 months. Well, they do report it every 3 months. And we measure this using something called gross domestic product, which is often just referred to as GDP. So you find that if you're watching the news, people will be talking about GDP, and that's what they mean. It's gross domestic product. And as you can see there, this is a measure of the size and the health of the country's economy. And actually what we can do is we can use it to compare the size of different economies and at different points in time. And one of the things I'd really recommend here is looking at the Bank of England website. It's actually a really informative website that explains things quite carefully and clearly, and is ideal for you to have a look at. So if we look at GDP, you can see that it presented here in terms of the growth rate, so the GDP growth rate percentage. And if you look at this, you can see that this goes up and down over a period of time. Although if you look around 2008, 2009, you can see it plummets. So you can see there was a very negative growth rate at that point. And this was when there was a last period of recession. And there were quite a variety of issues that caused economic problems around that time. So it tends to be a bit volatile, going up and down, and there are periods when it has GDP percentage has gone down quite markedly. What we see over time is that there's generally growth over time. So if I look at very recent data, so I've just literally now taken this off the Office for National Statistics, that's the ONS website, and they collect data on GDP. And you can see since 1955, this has actually, grown fairly consistently. Now you can pick up that blip in 2008 where you see that drop, but also you can see that in the last quarter in 2020, there was also this significant drop due to COVID-19 and the lockdown of the UK. So you can see how much of an impact that's actually happened. And this is actually measured, as you can see, in the thousands of, in £1 million. So there's quite a significant change there that's probably taken us back, getting on for about 10 years since, the early 2000s. So if we look at the business cycle, you'll see, if you look at that diagram on the left there, that, it does tend to go through peaks, a series of peaks and troughs, not as marked as the one that we have at the moment, but generally you see these little ups and downs. And one of the government objectives is trying to manage that cycle so you don't have too many really high peaks and too many low troughs. And when you're in a peak, you tend to have high levels of consumer spending. There's a lot of confidence about there, and so people are willing to spend money, and that filters through to business confidence. And this is where, businesses are tending to make profits, they're investing in things. But we also see that prices and costs tend to rise faster. But unemployment, on the other hand, tends to be lower. So the government's trying to manage this so we don't have too big a peaks and too many troughs. And of course, obviously, they've tried to manage things at the moment with things like the furlough scheme to try to reduce the significance of the trough that we're experiencing. So the government has quite an important role to play here in relation to unemployment. And where there's instability in the economy, this has an impact on employment. And the definition of unemployment, as you can see there, is those of working age who are without work, but who are available for work at current wage rates. Okay, so there are some people who aren't employed, but they're not available for work for various reasons. And also there's, issues in terms of what the rates of pay are. And there are all sorts of things beyond this sort of normal kind of up and down cycling that can have an effect on unemployment. So things like changing technology. So for example, you can sometimes see changes in parts of the country where perhaps the country was very dependent on a particular kind of industry. and that technology became redundant, and therefore that industry collapsed. And so, that can often create pockets of unemployment around the place. So, the government is obviously quite keen to make sure as many people are in employment as possible. And another thing that we'll pick up is changing patterns of work in the UK, because actually these are fairly significant in the event management sector. So examples I've got there are zero-hour contract and the gig economy. And one of the things that these have led to has actually been problems where people are underemployed. So people have fewer hours than they would like. So if I was face to face with you, I'd be asking you, what examples can you think of in the events sector? Now, a couple of ones I would give to you. You often employ people on 0 hours contracts in the events sector if you're employing hospitality workers. So, for instance, you only employ them when you actually have a live event running, and you don't need them at other times. And so they often have 0 hours contracts where they're not guaranteed to have more than a certain of hours of work. And then the events sector also uses a number of people who work in the gig economy. Now, the gig economy are technically self-employed people, and they will pick up short-term work. So the example you often see from the gig economy is things like the bicycle couriers, the people who do Uber Eats, that kind of thing. But actually, you have quite highly skilled people in the events sector who might offer some technical services to live events, and they also operate in the gig economy, and so they can be affected by this problem of underemployment too. And then the other thing where the business cycle is important is in relation to inflation. Now, inflation is about the rise in prices through the economy, and we will look at that. She says, looking at her list, we will look at that in a later session. So the government wants to try to keep inflation relatively low and stable, because a key thing is if you're running a business, it means that the price is relatively stable and wage rates can stay relatively stable. If inflation is growing rapidly, it means that prices are increasing. And for instance, if you're employed, it might mean that your salary doesn't buy you as much because other prices have risen. And so that's quite difficult from a business to manage. If their prices are rising and then they've maybe got staff who are demanding higher wages, that can be quite problematic. So that's why the government wants to keep inflation low and relatively stable. And if we have a period when there's rapid economic growth, this tends to cause inflation. So if you put it into an example I've given there of an event venue, what you might see is in a period of rapid growth, you might see there being high demand for events at that venue, and therefore you can rise prices, and that leads to further inflation. So you will often hear in the news about the Bank of England interest rates, and these are set and to try to actually keep inflation on target. So listen out for news on that. And then there's the balance of payments. Now, the balance of payments is a way of, one country looking at their economic relationship with other countries predominantly. And it looks at, all the transactions between the residents of one country and the rest of the world. And this has quite significant implications for government debt, in other words, how much the government owes other countries. And at the moment, in order to fund some of the economic support mechanisms, the government has had to go into further debt. And it also has implications for the exchange rate. And that can be quite significant if you are a business that has a lot of dealings internationally. Either you have international visitors attending your event, or some component of your event operation involves you purchasing products or services from another country. So that can be quite important too. So these are all things to look out for in the news, and hopefully that's given you a little bit of insight into what these terms are about.